Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the panel on student-centered practices. My name is Leah Kemp. I'm Associate Professor of Teaching here at the USC Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures. It's a mouthful. We have three presenters here today. I'm going to try to keep the time on a strict chronology here. So presenters, if I interrupt you after 15 minutes, please don't be offended. It's just so that we have time at the end for questions. And I'll ask that everyone put their questions in the chat or hold them until the end. And with that, why don't we move on to our first presenter? We have Laura Florand from Duke, and she will be presenting Vulnerable, Ungrading for Heartfelt Multilingual Writing.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining in this discussion today. As with many of us, I started ungrading during the pandemic when we were all switched to online learning. And as with many of us, this shift to ungrading was part of a comprehensive reconsideration of how I taught and the priorities implicit in my pedagogy. As Alfie, oops, hold on a second, there. As Alfie Kohn notes, ungrading does not come alone, but requires that we grapple with questions of curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, and issues of control. Ungrading then has never been for me an easy way out of doing the work of actual teaching, as Blackwelder states, but a part of rethinking everything about how I engage with my students. It was, in fact, part of a commitment to transformation, to use the words of Larson Freeman, and to mutual transformation that I hope has led to more optimal learning. This first shift to ungrading practices occurred in my 5th semester French language writing course, which was at that point a more generic writing course focusing on training students in 4 forms of writing: description, narration, essay, commentaire composé, and with a strong focus on writing as grammar, or perhaps grammar as writing. The course was at that time called Advanced Grammar and Composition, to give you an idea of the format that I had inherited. Most students come into this course at our university with a B2 or intermediate high level of communication in French. And in the course, I try to lead them to a C1 or advanced low level, or at least to be able to explore this level or probe into it. The course is capped at 12 students, so that's just something to keep in mind when I talk about feedback. Rethinking course design, grading, and assessment practices was part of how many of us responded to the pandemic. And in my case, I decided quickly that my main objectives in such a traumatic and isolating time were community building against all odds, giving space to students to express and affirm self in social connection with others, bringing play and joie de vivre into a difficult situation, and giving space to make meaning during and out of a difficult situation. As I've noted with one of my presentational partners and colleagues, Maria Bobroff, in another presentation, we argue, as many do, that ungrading leads to greater equity, creativity and risk-taking, agency and well-being in the classroom. And I found through my several semesters now of practicing it that it also gives space for vulnerable and heartfelt writing, so students can really express what most matters to them. In all our discussions of linguistic competencies, this is something I feel we do not articulate nearly enough, that not only can students learn to accomplish pragmatic goals, such as learning where a restaurant is at one level or engaging in political arguments at another, but they can, the importance of being able to express themselves, their heart, their emotions, their sense of humor, their sarcasm, cynicism, vulnerability, all of it. And that's what led to the title of this talk, Vulnerable, Ungrading for Heartfelt Multilingual Writing. Again, I want to stress that I do not think just shifting from grading to ungrading a writing class or any other class will create the space for heartfelt communication, but I do think ungrading is part of it. And so as I grappled with the other transformations to myself as language professional and to this course, I kept a focus on certain questions such as, I am a creative writer myself, and I often also have to write analytically. What aspects of a writing course would kill my joy in writing? When have I considered writing a slog, and when have I considered it a joy? or something very meaningful into which I sank deeply? What things have hurt my ability to write? And through a revision process every semester of the course, some of the other shifts that I decided were essential in addition to the shift to ungrading are a strong emphasis on community building practices, which encourages more writing for self and peers rather than the professor. In my particular case, some examples of these were a lot of collaborative writing, which is often playful in nature, frequent peer feedback sessions, and in these sessions, the professor, I put myself on the level of the peers in terms of as a reader rather than as a judge of their writing. I think also it's very important to have an inviting course arc. So I ditched that old course arc with very easy on-ramps. And I think Meg Malone in her talk was just referencing this, the importance of, letting students level up as they work and not starting at too high a level for them. The work has to be meaningful, personally meaningful to the writers asked to do it. We have to, of course, have input before output scaffolding. The writing always needs to be low stakes. And this, I mean, in terms of if it's got a grade, it's never going to be low stakes really for students. And so what I wanted was the stakes to be personal, what the writer wants to communicate, the impact they want to have, the self-reflection that the writing invites them to make. And then with this, a practice of regular student reflection that involved looking at their goals, their development, the risk they had taken, the writing that made them proud. This is just a quick look at what the units look like now, finding your voice. So again, it's a 5th semester course, but we start out very, very simply so that they learn the power of simplicity and then move on from there. And the first example of the one example of an activity that I'm going to show you in detail is from that very early, the first thing they do in the class. Again, coming in with probably a B2 level, ideally, but we start out looking at how much you can say with how few words. So this is an example of how we would structure one activity in the course or one set of activities. They start with a reading of 5 lists excerpted from Engel Huon's Même les méchants rêves d'amour, which is a chick lit book in France in which a main character tries to write down everything she can before dementia claims her memories. So they look at a list of things she doesn't want to forget, a list of things she hopes to forget, another list she makes of things she wants to never forget, a list of scents she does that make her happy, a list of sounds that make her happy. They first work on this analytically, both in class and in forum discussions. We look at the emotional power of these lists, what gives them that power. So we break it down in that way. And then we do also look at the attention to form. I mean, that is going to be part of what you polish as a writer. When you make grammatical mistakes, especially with something as simple as a list, you're going to pull the reader away from your writing. So we talk about that too, but it's just not the only focus of the writing. Then they move to the output stage. So creative responses, which would be first a collaborative writing in class. One that has been pretty successful is for them to make bucket lists together of things they want to do on campus before they graduate. And then they do their own creative work where they write their own list, choosing 4 of the 5 topics or creating another similar topic if they like. This one I have really enjoyed because many students, as simple as it seems, many students have described to me falling into flow as they write these lists and not wanting to stop thinking about these things. And then the impact it had on them to actually sit down and think about these things, which is exactly what I want. And then post writing, we'll have discussions in class of the challenges or the pleasures in working on this writing. And then they get to choose each longer unit, what work they most want to work on again. And so if they choose to work on this, then it would go into development sessions, writing workshops with their peers. My ungrading method throughout is that no points can be lost for doing work. All work submitted receives full credit. I do track it. I know some ungraders don't, but to me, language learning really requires daily assignments or multiple assignments a week. And so I need to keep track. So I keep track of it with checks. I don't myself excuse any work for any reason. If I came up with that work for them to do, I think it's valuable for them to do. And so I do stick with that, but I do allow makeups and redos. The kind of feedback I do is really to focus on writer empowerment and the connection between reader and writer. And so I start with what I like about this. which is also how we start in peer feedback sessions. How I reacted emotionally, my ideas for what might help heighten impact or give more punch to something they're trying to do. Questions that might help strengthen the questions that might help strengthen the message and clarity. And then finally, grammar is just as a tool to be tweaked or polished for the impact of the writing, and again, not the reason for the writing. And in that context, I would just like to bring out this quote from Larson Freeman, which I really like, on what constitutes an error and accepting the creative process. Teachers do need to make learners aware of the consequences of the linguistic choices learners make. However, language is not a closed system, and there is, in fact, no linguistic basis for distinguishing a linguistic innovation from an error, because both are contingent upon the speaker's perception of and acting on the affordances in the context to create meaning and to position oneself in a manner one wishes, engaging in the agentive process of audience design by tailoring their message to interlocutors and other audiences. Knowing this may make it possible to disrupt understandings of what constitutes an error and become more accepting of what is essentially a creative process. And then just want to finish quickly with some results that I've had. So first I want to share with you results from students. And so this is actually how I learned that these changes were making it so possible for students to reach into what really mattered for them, is what they started commenting on in their reflections. So for example, I have written several literary, rhetorical, and film analyses in my French classes, but I have never written anything where I truly had the impression that it came straight from my heart. That's exactly what I feel about this piece. Or another student, even though our rating stayed very simple, referring to that first unit of the class, I found that it had a great emotional impact. For myself, these simple assignments helped me better understand my feelings at the beginning of university. For example, I was forced to re-examine everything from the last year and think of all the things I lost because of the pandemic. Or one that really touched me, a week before we came back to class, I lost my grandmother. She died after a long and painful battle against cancer, and some of my writing reflected my feelings. And in addition to feelings, they talk about bringing out their own sense of identity a lot. So, for example, this student who talks about how she has been writing and reading forever, but she had the impression that her writing abilities in English were completely separate from her writing abilities in French. And so one of her goals was to be able to feel herself in French. Or the student who talks about how the list that we started with in imitating the style of the works of that author let her explore how she could develop a unique voice, comic or dramatic as a writer, and express more personality in her work, like being sarcastic and speaking in a hyperbole. Or another student who also got to embrace their drier and more sarcastic writing and began to have really, as she describes it, a lot of, or perhaps he, I can't remember, a lot of fun doing it, right? The more I got into it, the more I abandoned my hesitations. And in the end, I really had fun with it. And then just a quick commentary on my own results, because I think those are important too. And oh, sorry, I had one more, had just pulled some common words that popped up in student comments and they were values, value-oriented, community-oriented, and voice-oriented a lot. So my values, our values, my classmates, my community, to better know both themselves and their peers, my voice, myself, moving, universal. So those really struck me because they were repeated over and over in student reflections. And then my own results and feedback are these. First of all, delight. It's radically changed my approach to student writing. And so that instead of dreading, oh no, I have, all these essays to grade, I would wake up in the morning and it would be the first thing I want to do is to sit down and read what they had come up with, right? And I knew I could react to it just naturally with like warmth myself, rather than having to think about, okay, how do I give it a grade? And again, that leads to the next one, the warmth and community. The classroom really became a space of happiness, exploration, and connection. Understanding, you learn a lot more about where your students are coming from, what really matters to them, what they're currently dealing with, and where they want to go next. And then just maybe connected to the warmth and community, but the sense of ease. There is just that tension that grading creates is gone, right? And so you have this emotional ease between students and professor, and between them too, because they're not in competition with each other anymore. They're collaborating to help each other improve their writing. So I'll stop there. I know we have tight time. And I have 2 seconds, so.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Laura. That was very interesting and inspiring. Next, we have Emil Asanov from West Virginia University, and he will be presenting on cheating the system. What do Russian language students think of authorized cheat sheets?
Oh, yeah, thank you so much for, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Just give me 1 second, and I think you should be able to see my slides now, right?
Yes.
Let me just make sure I'm in the right. Sorry, there's like a Zoom thing that. Perfect. Can you still see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Well, I'm very happy to be here today because, ungrading is important. We've been talking a lot about ungrading now sessions. And for me, ungrading kind of leads us to reconsider the practices that we have post-assessment, but also pre-assessment. And I'm probably going to talk about something that happens mostly pre and during assessment, if it makes sense, because I'm going to discuss this idea of the authorized cheat sheet. And yeah, so we're going to talk about how we can cheat the system, especially if we're in a system where, formal testing is encouraged and we cannot really come up with alternative assessments, so we cannot come up with ungrading. And especially if you're in a position where, like I find myself, even though my coordinator is very understanding and I've tried a lot of different things, I know that other graduate teaching assistants, and I'm a graduate teaching assistant, other graduate teaching assistants may not have as much creativity in their classroom when it comes to assessment. So they may approach the testing that they have to do a little bit creatively, rather than replacing their assignments in a super creative way because their supervisor may not really approve of that. But basically what I'm going to talk about today very briefly is the idea of positive psychology, and especially positive psychology in, second language learning. And I'm going to talk about how testing and evaluations can be part of Henry Giroux would call like oppressive pedagogies, and how we can reconsider them. And I'm also going to talk about how we can approach testing and evaluations, so it can include any kinds of assessment, but particularly testing, with positive psychology interventions. And then I'm going to move on to what people in literature call the authorized cheat sheet, but other people may refer to it as a helpful sheet, or they may call it something else. Then I'm going to talk about the study that I did with my students, because my presentation is based on what my students thought of the authorized cheat sheets that they've used on their summative assessments. And then at the end, we're just going to have a summary of what students think of the authorized cheat sheet. So positive psychology in language learning has received a lot of attention, and very briefly, and this is like a definition that I've generated for myself according to the literature that I've read. In positive psychology, you recognize both positive and negative emotions, and positive and negative emotions are not one-dimensional. So there's more to them than we think, because for some people, anxiety can be more of a negative emotion than for others. And for some people, anxiety can be a positive emotion, because anxiety also helps us to think about ways that we can deal with the situation if that situation happens, right? So when I say positive and negative, it doesn't mean the emotions are one-dimensional. People can experience them differently. But generally speaking, when you engage in positive psychology, you recognize these emotions that arise in the process of learning, and then you address the emotions that seem to be more negative, so that you can turn students' grows into their glows, so that they can work on their strengths and become more comfortable with the learning process, because that's the idea. And positive psychology has been implemented in second language learning in order to improve our students' performances and then contribute to their well-being, and also increase their motivation to learn the target language, right? To kind of move toward that, intrinsic motivation, so students can enjoy learning the language rather than just thinking about how tiresome or hard it is, especially if they have to do the just to fulfill the requirements that they have. And through positive psychology, students can often find themselves thinking of language learning as this positive, engaging task where they can immerse themselves. And I'm glad that Laura brought it up, the state of flow, right? When they find themselves in this position where like they want to fully engage with the task, where they have positive effect, and then where their performance is increased as well, because they are working not toward just, submitting as a home assignment, or maybe they're working toward, learning more about the specific aspect of the target language culture, or they may maybe they're thinking about how they can use it in a day, like in a real life situation. So that's the idea of positive psychology. However, we also have something that's called anxiety. And even though I said anxiety can be viewed as a positive or negative emotion at the same time, anxiety oftentimes, especially anxiety that's related to tests, which is test anxiety, can contribute to the overall feeling of what is called L2 anxiety, so second language learning anxiety. And that can be a very unwelcome state of like emotional, psychological arousal that can deter our students from learning the language and engaging with the language and wanting to communicate. So in other words, it can affect their willingness to communicate in the target language. And we don't want test anxiety to be a major contributor to their learning experience, because it's not going to contribute to it at all. It's going to mess it up for them, basically. And we want to make sure that we decrease L2 anxiety as much as possible, because we want our students to be comfortable with the language that they're learning. And one of the sources of that test anxiety, of L2 anxiety, has been found to be testing. And whether we like it or not, formal testing is still very common in our classrooms. And unfortunately, it's also been found to cause students a lot of anxiety and stress, right? And it's not because we implemented, but because formal testing is everywhere in higher education. Like maybe they walk into our classroom and they experiment with a lot of creative assignments, but then they go into a different classroom where they have a very, long test at the end of the semester, and just the idea of the test, and it all starts in K-12, obviously, just kind of impacts their understanding of what a test is. And many students, maybe they don't have the language for that, but they think of it as a gatekeeping, punishing procedure, right? So, and they think that they're just passive subjects, like in the banking model of education, according to Freire, right? They just like take stuff out of their heads, put it on a piece of paper, and then leave, and nothing really sticks. And then in second language studies in particular, scholars have found that L2 learning anxiety and test anxiety can affect students' self-confidence. And it especially happens when we have a language that's drastically different from the student's first language, right? Because they look at different structures and they're worried that they may do something wrong on a piece of paper rather than applying the language in meaningful real life situations. That is why scholars have been talking about these positive psychology interventions, and people have come up with different ways to combat this L2 anxiety and to make sure that it decreases. And people have argued that our tests should be fair, that they should be doable, and they should provide the students this opportunity to show what they really know, and also give them this feeling of success. So it kind of ties into this idea of washback, that students look at the assessment and they can see how they've grown and how they can also learn from the assessment. And people have talked about think aloud protocols. They've talked about immediate recall, so students can build this meaningful relationship with the assessments that they have in the classroom. And one positive psychology intervention that I've used in my classroom is called the Authorized cheat sheet. And maybe it's kind of reclaiming this idea of cheating, because often cheating is frowned upon. But essentially an authorized cheat sheet, or registered cheat sheet, or as I already said, like a helpful sheet, depending on who decides to use what term in their research, is usually like a student-produced piece of paper, and it can be handwritten or printed, that some educators have found to be this very helpful tool for students to deepen their learning and also reduce test anxiety as students study for exams. And we kind of explore why why it has such an effect on the students. So here's an example of our student produced, so basically the authorized cheat sheet in my classroom. One of the students used this piece of paper, so basically it's just a note card that you can get from any stationery store. And for those that teach Russian or speak Russian, you can recognize that it's an authorized cheat sheet in Russian. So it was done for one of the tasks that the student had to do. And cheat sheets have been found helpful across different fields, and the research across different decades has shown that cheat sheets, they can improve our students' performances. They can also help to reduce the anxiety the students have that as it relates to testing. And most importantly, can also encourage this better engagement with course material, because students can use cheat sheets as an opportunity to review the material that they have to study for the test. And it can also help them shape their studying habits. So maybe they can start using, cheat sheets on like just like index cards for anything as they prepare for their tests. And they can also help them to be better prepared for real life situations, because some have argued that cheat sheets are useful tools for students to learn to solve problems with reference materials. So students kind of engage with whatever they have to use to learn better. However, scholars have also been worried about students forming this dependency of on cheat sheets, and also people are a little bit skeptical of the fact that sometimes students cannot really decide what they can put on their cheat sheet, so it causes them anxiety. So that's like the other side to consider. And in second language learning, not a lot of scholars have talked about this, but was one study that was conducted in Finland. It was a group of high school EFL students that were found to view cheat sheets positively, and because cheat sheets help them engage with the material and review the material before the test. But there were also students that were skeptical, right? And I think it's important to talk about that. They thought that cheat sheets cause dependency, and they weren't really comfortable using the cheat sheet because they thought they couldn't use whatever they had in their heads to pass the tests, and they had to rely on the piece of paper a lot. And then also some students were a little bit worried about the fact that they have to spend a lot of time creating their cheat sheets. So in my classroom, a cheat sheet is basically a note card or index card, depending what term you prefer, that students are invited to bring. So they don't have to bring it. So it's not like they must bring it to every test that they have. They invited to bring it because if they don't want to bring it, it's fine. But in my experience, everyone brings it because it's a very useful way to navigate stress. And then students can write on both sides of the note card. And while students have a list of topics that they need to study for the test, it's up to students to decide what they write on their note card. So I don't tell them that you should have, case endings or you should have, conjugations. No, they decide for themselves what they want to put on their note card, depending on what they prefer. Do they want to put the things that they want to work on, or do they want to put the things that they're comfortable using, but sometimes maybe forget? Anyway, it's totally up to the students. And this is just an example of one of my students' cheat sheets. As you can see, for those, as I said, that speak Russian, can read Russian, and teach Russian, you can see that there are, adjectives and also different endings for the adjectives, and also spelling rules like the 7-letter rule. So the student decided to organize her cheat in this particular way. And the reason I want to kind of get the opinions of my students on this practice is because I want to improve this practice for myself, and I want to improve this practice for my students. That's why it was more of an action research study. Then I wanted to explore how my students felt about the cheat sheets. Yeah, I give them those cheat sheets and they bring them, but I don't know how they feel about them. Maybe they don't like them, maybe they love them. I don't know, maybe they view it as an oppressive strategy that I just like impose on them because I'm like, bring the cheat sheets. Maybe they don't want to do that. And then I also want to contribute to the research that looks at how learning a language that's drastically different from the first language the students speak can be facilitated through like the use of cheat sheets. So the question that I had for my study is how did the cheat sheets perform as a positive psychology intervention for college students on summative Russian language tests? So that was basically the overall question that guided me. So in the study, I had 10 undergraduate students that I interviewed in 2 focus groups. It was last summer. And because all the students that I had in my focus groups were my students, I also kind of utilized what's called the acquaintance interviews. But because this is like more of a practitioner presentation, I'm not going to delve into the methodology, but I included the references at the end, so you'll be able to read those on at your own pace if you want to. And then I analyzed my data using what's called emotion coding. So I looked at the words that students use to describe their emotions, like words like stressed, excited, sad, happy, and words like that, to see what they thought of the cheat sheets. So according to my focus group interviews with students, I arrived at 3 themes that are like arose in their responses. And the first theme was cheat sheets help students experience positive emotions. Then cheat sheets help students condense information. And then also cheat sheets present challenges to the students, which was an interesting theme to explore, actually. So here I have like a summary of this of the first theme, which is cheat sheets help students experience positive emotions. And here you can see in this mind map the exact emotions that students had when they were talking about the use of cheat sheets, like relief, peace of mind, surprise, excitement, and happiness. And I also have a couple of excerpts for you to kind of look at. I know that we are short in time, but I'm going to list a couple of them for you. So some people thought that they were ecstatic when they found out that they could bring a cheat sheet because they weren't really worried about the test itself, but they were worried about the language because for them, Russian seemed like one of those things where they were like, okay, I need to navigate all these things. I need to navigate all the grammar, vocabulary, and everything. And these were the students that just had their first year Russian. So a lot of the assignments that we do, especially like formal assignments that we had in that course, were very accuracy oriented, even though I kind of tried to include more, appropriacy and more communicative tasks into the testing. There was still a lot of tasks that were accuracy oriented. So accuracy can sometimes scare students, which is why they were like, okay, I need to make sure I remember all these things. So the note cards really helped them and gave them peace of mind. And then other people talked about how the idea of finals week was just intimidating. And then they had this Russian test that they had to take, and then they had all the other papers to do. So the fact that they had the cheat sheet gave them a sense of relief. And then people were excited, right? So they were terrified, but then they were like, okay, so we have this, cheat sheet, so it can relieve us of this anxiety. So that helped them before the test. And then they had surprise because they were like, okay, I did not expect that, but here we go. And they were very happy. And other people were happy because they were stressing about the test. And then people thought that cheat sheets were a great way to review the information because it helped them to organize everything they had learned prior to the test. And as one of the students said, condense everything because they could put on the note card things that were really, really important for them to remember. And that also gave them an opportunity to see how all things in the language fit together, right? So they could connect the cases and they could connect other things. And as I said, that helped them review the material and the vocabulary that they needed to know just out, not only for the test, but outside the test. And it also was this kind of like this safety net, safety ring, because even though the students said that they didn't have to use the note card the first time they used it, the fact that they had it provided them with like that sense of relief, and it was like a safety ring for them. And I should have said that all the names of the students are the pseudonyms, so it can be safer. But then cheat sheets also presented challenges. For one student, they presented a challenge because it was both a source of relief and anxiety, and it's kind of in line with the existing literature because they didn't know what exactly to put on their note card. So they were stressing about that. And then it was the same for other students because they're like, what should I put on my note card when I have such limited space? And then students just thought about the fact that their cheat sheet, as they said, sucked. They were like, well, I'm not sure if it's good enough, but because maybe they were comparing themselves with other people. So overall, cheat sheets were good resource of happiness for students, and they use this as a great opportunity to revise the material. But then also they said that preparing the cheat sheet caused them additional anxiety. So yeah, and here I have references so you can scan them with the QR code, and I'll be more than happy to put them in the chat as well. I'm sorry if it was a little bit kind of rushed, but I hope you enjoyed learning about this practice, and I'll be more than happy to connect with you if you want to shoot me an email or if you want to talk to me anywhere else. All right, so thank you so much for your attention.
Great, Emil. Thank you so much. That was very rich information. Next, we have Lake Mathison, who is coming to us from Royalton Public Schools in Minnesota, and she will be presenting on meaningful assessment through learning progressions.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. I've occasionally had some issues with my computer just cutting out the audio, and hopefully I took it to the IT and hopefully they will have figured that out. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I'm normally looking at I'm normally doing it not in the app, but somewhere else. Okay, we'll do the best that I can. Oh, sorry, hold on. I'm sorry, I did not test this out to see if I could get the screen share. I'm normally using it in the browser version instead of, sorry, instead of in the app.
Would you like to email it or drop it in the chat and I can
Yeah,
share
I might have to. I might have to do that because now it's saying if I want to share it that I need permissions that I'm not given. So I'd like to.
There's a message here from DTS, from Tech Services.
Okay.
If you find you cannot share, leave the breakout room and message DTS and ask to be upgraded to co-host.
Oh, okay.
So
I don't know if that's the issue, but I can try. I have to message them.
that's what it's saying in the
Okay.
chat.
Okay.
They say yes.
Leah, would you like us to go ahead and field some questions while
Sure, that would be great,
we scan our
actually.
questions?
Does anyone have any questions for Emil or Laura? I have a kind of a general question. Emil mentioned supervisors not approving of these kind of creative changes. And I was going to ask, what are your talking points when you need to present these sorts of ideas to people who may not have heard of them before?
Well, as I've said, for me, it wasn't really a problem because my supervisor is very understanding when it comes to that. But I know that other people in our department, like if it's different languages, their coordinators may not have been as like lenient, or may not have been as approving of different practices that lie beyond like the syllabus, or like lay beyond the syllabus or something like that. So yeah, that's a great question for me as well, because in the future, like, when I have a different supervisor, or like when I kind of teach as like when I teach not as a GTA, or when I have a different position, like what do I do? So that's a great question as well for me.
Laura, have you run into that?
Well, I kind of am the supervisor, so not in that sense, but I do run into when I talk to, the instructors that, in courses that I coordinate, et cetera, that, they're often very resistant. And one of the things that comes up is a question about like rigor, or how do we
Right.
make students do what I want? And I actually did have a slide on that, but cut it for time. It's just like, as I call it, saying no to bonsai pedagogy. You have to kind of release that control. But also, I just really disagree that about the rigor. First of all, it's not a word I love, but I also think that once students do it for its own value for themselves, they actually do much more than when they're trying to jump through your hoops. Unless
Mhm.
your hoops are just really kind of insane, maybe, but normally for themselves, they'll go farther than they will for someone else. So those are kind of the response, some of the quickly, some of the responses I have to that kind of thing.
Great. Like, what do you think?
It does not look like it made a difference. Ugh, it's still okay. I mean, I can just talk. Like you can just look at my face. I spent all this time adding all sorts of graphics and things to my presentation, but it doesn't change anything. So that's fine. All right. So basically, what is the topic of my talk? Meaningful assessment through learning progression. So basically, I want to talk about what is traditional assessment, and I don't want anyone to feel like they're being called out if they notice something, some aspects of their assessment that I am calling traditional, and then that I am saying that they are problematic. But then I want to contrast that with learning progressions. I'll mention briefly who developed them, what they are, and why I think that they're better suited to assessing language proficiency, just in general, and why I think they are more aligned with the goals of ungrading. And then a little bit about how I have made the switch to learning progressions, and then the benefits that I see of doing so. So basically, a hurdle to ungrading, I think, is traditional assessment. The way that we traditionally assess is a hurdle to embracing the ungrading philosophy. So traditional assessment, I would say, includes things like matching, multiple choice, short answer. Basically, when you are assessing discrete vocab, discrete grammar, And then your questions are going to have right or wrong answers. In the case of a short answer, occasionally you'll have something that you could give partial points. But in general, it's going to have a right answer or a wrong answer. And just by that, its very nature, that lends itself to tallying points. And when you're trying to ungrade, how can you give feedback if the only feedback that the student really sees is this is how many I got right, this is how many I got wrong. So I think that has some room for improvement. So what are learning progressions? Learning progressions were created by Elise Burns and David Frangiosa. They come from STEM. They are STEM teachers. They have a background in physics education and some other science classes. And so they created a book, which I have here. So if you can see me, at least you can see the book, if not my slideshow. It's called Going Gradeless. Shifting the focus to student learning, and they refer to learning progressions as assessment 3.0. So traditional grading is assessment 1.0, and then there's standards-based grading, which is more popular within the K-12 area of education. And they say, that is an improvement on traditional grading, but that's 2.0, and they view learning progressions as like a 3.0, an additional step in the evolution towards assessment that allows students to focus on their learning and not on arbitrary numbers and letters. So what are learning progressions? They are basically scales. So in some sense, they share some similarities with standards-based grading and with rubrics. So what they do is they delineate the learning objectives. What are the learning objectives for this course? Each one has multiple levels of performance, and they describe the characteristics of each level. So it's still kind of sounding like a rubric, but how a rubric is different is that a rubric is for a specific assignment, and a learning objective is meant, or a learning progression is meant to kind of provide an outlook for wherever a student is starting, and then whatever their next step would be throughout the whole term, not just one particular assignment. Another characteristic of learning progressions is that they have a low floor and a high ceiling. So what does that mean? A low floor means they are accessible to students who are uncomfortable, are nervous, are learning, are beginners. That there is some place for them to start, right? It doesn't feel like here's the expectation and they have to leap to reach it. Like there's a place that anyone can access. But they also have a high ceiling, meaning that the levels of progress continue up to the point that someone would need to stretch. So there's plenty of room for improvement and for growth over the course of a term. Why do I think that these are more appropriate for world language than traditional assessments? For one thing, they are skill-based, which I think makes sense for language because language is a skill. It is reading, it is writing, it's listening, it's speaking, it's communicating, it's interacting with people. So rather than focus on, this is the unit on family vocab, so you're going to learn all the family vocab. It's more like, what can you do with that vocabulary? What can you demonstrate? What can you understand? What can you communicate to someone else? So they're skill-based. They're also designed as a continuum, which is how language works, that a person doesn't master the present tense and then move on to the past tense, right? That we're constantly improving in different areas, that certain skills are late acquired, that we have different orders in which we're expected to learn things, and it's all a matter of time and progress. So that learning progression expects that to be the case. It's also strengths-based as opposed to deficit-based. So the problem with a lot of rubrics and a lot of sometimes standards-based scales is that the language that they use is oftentimes more focused on like, here's what you were supposed to do, here's the perfect example, and then here's the frequency with which you didn't do it. So like you always met the standard, or you sometimes met the standard, or you infrequently, or you never met the standard. And that doesn't so much tell students what they should do, it more informs them of how much they failed. And so learning progressions with their low floor says like, this is what you can do now. And this is the most basic way that this can be done. And now if you just did a little bit more or you changed it up a little bit, that's how you can level up, right? So it gives them kind of this stepping stone scaffold to how to continue to improve. If you were going to switch to learning progressions, first you would need to decide what you're going to assess, which for language is relatively easy, especially if you're teaching at the language level. Then you create your learning progression language, and then you kind of need to revamp your assessment so that your assessment aligns with what you are with the progressions. So to figure out what to assess, I think the easiest is to break it into skills: reading, listening, writing, or speaking. Or you can go kind of the actful modes, which is interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational, although those still kind of break down into the same sorts of skills. The original learning progression that was designed by Burns and Frangiosa has 5 different levels. They do beginning, developing, proficient, advanced, and expert. I choose not to use those particular descriptors because I think some of those, especially proficient, advanced, and expert, are problematic, especially when it comes to language learning. So I actually use actful language, which is bears some similarities between like the inverted pyramid, if you can imagine, since it's not on the screen, the actful inverted pyramid where you have novice, low at the bottom, and then you have intermediate in the middle, advanced, superior, distinguished. So I tend, because of the students that I work with, I tend to break my scale into 6 instead of 5, but I go novice low, novice mid, novice high, intermediate low, intermediate mid, intermediate high. And then the language that I use to describe those, I borrow and heavily simplify from actful. So I'm letting students know, for example, if I'm assessing speaking, novice low is I'm saying individual words and phrases. Novice mid is I'm using memorized sentences. Novice high is I'm starting to use some creative language by replacing or adding in additional words, right? So I'm not just reproducing something memorized, but I'm starting to be creative. Then when it comes to revamping assessment, the hard part is when you have like a large school, a large department with multiple sections, and you have to have something standardized. That's the hard part. A baby step towards revamping assessment would be to rewrite the questions so that they're targeted according to level descriptors. So like, these are the questions that target whether students can understand at the word level, which would be novice low. These are the questions that target whether students are understanding the main idea of this passage, which would be more like novice mid. So you can use your actful language, figure out where your goals are, and then target your questions so that over the course of the whole test, you have a span where you can see, are they mostly understanding at the word level? Are they able to understand also at the main idea? Are they able to understand specific details? Or like, where's the level of breakdown? If you want to completely revamp, then you start doing tasks instead of discrete questions. And that's what I've moved towards, not to say it's perfect, but it's something, because I want to see what the students can do rather than catch them, right? Discrete questions tend to catch students in what they can't do. One of the benefits that I think of learning progressions is its flexibility. So I have my learning progression set out with all of the levels that all of the class lessons, like the class levels that I teach. It spans all of them. So students can both see where they are and then where next year they might be expected to land and the year after that. It also provides some good scaffolding because students can see this is where I am. Right now I'm at individual words. Oh, but if I just memorize some sentences, now I'm already kind of moving up a level. Or, oh, if I take this memorized sentence and I'm comfortable with those, but I take out some words and I replace them with some new words, or I add some adjectives, or I add something, like now that'll already be leveling me from one level up to the next one. So it provides students with a really clear goal of like, what's their next step to be able to improve. And I think that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.